How we doing?
Sounds good.
All right.
Cool.
Everything, all the levels check out.
Is that a pun because we're going to talk about leveling?
Oh, damn.
We do good work.
Wow. No, I mean,
Wow.
I wasn't going for it, but now that you've mentioned it, yes.
Okay, man, are you ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Now, come on, now crank this motherfucker up.
Break it down like this.
Hello, Internet. Gino, that Guido Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And today is a special off-week podcast. We've got a topic of discussion that I think people will be interested in. We're going to level up our discussion today
Woo.
by talking about leveling systems in games, progression systems. They're in every game nowadays, it seems. And I just thought, hey, considering there are so many games that have them, I wanted to see, why do we think that everyone and their grandma decides that they want to have this mechanic built into their game? What are some games that stand out as a good example of leveling? What's a kind of rote or less engaging way that leveling's been deployed recently? So to discuss this topic, I'm joined as always by Pete Busby.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Excited to talk about progression in gaming, an important topic when it comes to game design. For this week's fun fact, I thought, we could use an upbeat one. So this is from an article by Live Science. It's from 2015, a little old, but still interesting. And the headline basically includes all the information you need. Mishka, first sea otter with asthma, learns to use an inhaler. So at the Seattle Aquarium, Mishka, at the time a 1-year-old sea otter, was found out to have asthma. First sea otter they've ever found with asthma. So they tried to teach her to use an inhaler. But they don't make inhalers for otters because, like I said, none have ever been found with asthma before. So they had to train her to use one for cats. But by all accounts, it seemed to have worked out fine.
Well,
Mishka's having fun learning how. Yep. And she's doing okay, I think.
Cats have inhalers?
Yeah, I guess, but not sea otters.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Why has cat asthma not been used in more sitcoms as a plot point?
Why are we just finding out about this now?
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't know how this slipped through the cracks somehow. But
I need to give a cat asthma. I need to give a cat asthma so I can get that cheap puffer.
That good cat asthma medicine.
Yeah. Look, if horse tranquilizers are good, I have to imagine that cat inhalers are great. Joined, as always, also by M. Palladino. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about progression systems. I just came up with a new bit, by the way.
Ooh.
Literally as I was sitting here because...
My favorite bits are the ones that are sprung live.
Yes. As everyone knows, I'm big into Final Fantasy XIV. My activities for the last about 3 days in Final Fantasy XIV have been leveling my fisher. You can fish in Final Fantasy, and it's a big pain in the ass. I am currently waiting for a fishing spot to have the weather change so that I can catch a fish for a quest. My bid is going to be what I'm doing in Final Fantasy for the near future.
I like this bit. So you have to wait for the in-game weather to change? Can you cast some sort of magics?
No, you have to wait. There is an in-game weather system. It changes about every 20 minutes.
Okay.
And certain fish only spawn with certain weather conditions.
I played Animal Crossing. I know how this works.
Yeah, you're familiar. But leveling in Final Fantasy XIV is not the most innovative of leveling, especially if you're having to fish hundreds of fucking fish every single time.
Can you do anything with, like, the other fish? Like, do they give you anything?
I mean, you can sell them, but they don't sell for much.
Mm.
Like, it's not a money-making venture most of the time.
Okay.
You can make paintings using them.
You can make paintings using
Yeah.
fish.
Yeah, so you take a canvas and then you attach the fish to it.
What?
And then it's like they made a print of the fish. It's like a
Okay.
drawing. Yeah.
All right. I was assuming that you hold the fish in your hand like a brush,
Yes.
and you just rub the fish on the paint.
I mean, the big one that people go for is called the let's see, what's his name? It's got a really fancy name, Warden of the Seven Hues, which is a rainbow fish.
That's a
which you
fish
can-
name?
Yes, that is a fish
That's
name.
way too complicated for a
They
fish
have a
name.
lot of silly names for their fish. And you can only catch that if you catch a fish of different colors beforehand. And then you can catch it. And it's got a very small chance of actually appearing. So that one you can probably paint with because it's rainbow. Get it?
I get it. I want each of the fish to be, you just like rub its head on the canvas. I need blue. Oh, well, I guess I gotta catch a sardine.
I think it might be like a footprint or something, because I caught a bucket yesterday, which is a minion that you can have follow you around. It's like enchanted. And then I caught another one, but you can't trade it. So I was like, well, what do I do with this? And so I just made a painting of it, and it's just a circle, because you
But
just
you
stuck the
can't-
bottom of the bucket to it.
but you can't eat any of the fish?
You can make food out of the fish, some of them, not all of them. You have the culinarian class.
Fuck.
Yeah, there's all kinds of... There's Disciples of Land, which is like mining, botany, fishing, and then Disciples of Hand, which is crafting. Culinarian deals with fish-related crafts.
Okay. I do fishcraft.
Yep.
We're gonna play this game at some point, and it's
Yeah.
gonna be great.
This is just my way of hyping you up until you
Excellent.
get to playing it.
Could you have eaten the bucket?
No, you cannot eat the bucket.
Boo.
It's just a little friend. It follows you around. It's got a fish inside of the bucket that sometimes jumps out.
Could you eat the fish in the bucket?
I haven't tried.
Well, try it if you catch another bucket. Can't trade it. You already have a painting.
Yeah, nothing else to do with it. You can't sell it. It would sell for a lot because it's really fucking rare, and I got it twice.
Well, before we go into our main topic, just a reminder, you can get in touch with the show at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got comment sections and deeplistenspodcast at gmail.com. You can mail in. We are still looking for feedback on Deep Dungeons, Dungeons Deep. Did people enjoy that? Because we can make that a regular off-week show. Or not. So just go ahead if you have strong opinions either way. You can also support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/deeplistens. That will gain you access to our Discord, and it will also help support the show. Help pay for some of these games that we're getting and some of our hosting costs. So we love putting on the show for y'all, and any support you can offer. It's much appreciated. Do we have anything on the Discord report, Em?
Not really. It's been a slow week.
Yeah, everyone's just stuck in quarantine. ZP's just trawling the just complete bottom of the barrel of NBA Twitter and just posting it and adding
ZP
it.
There's still posts on NBA Twitter? Like, all about what?
It's not great. They're really just like stretching, like people
You can
complaining
imagine.
about LeBron and Kyrie and whether LeBron had better teams than MJ. You know, real just meaningless conversations.
Hard-hitting journalism.
Hard-hitting stuff. Let me see if I can get the last post that was just like, oh yeah. Apparently, Pete, did you know that Chase Budinger is a volleyball player now?
What?
Yes.
No? I mean, that's interesting, but okay.
Apparently, Chase Budinger is a budding, almost Olympic level volleyball player, beach volleyball player.
Really?
Yes.
Wasn't he played for the Celtics, right? Or am I thinking of somebody else?
I think you're thinking of Brian Scalabrine.
Maybe. I'm always thinking of Scal.
He played for the Timberwolves, I believe, for a bit. I think Budinger might have been on the Rockets for a minute. He bounced around. He was a journeyman.
You know who I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of Jared Sullinger.
That is a different man.
Yes, completely different.
Very different person. Very different skill set. Chase Budinger was just... He was a lot of... what's his name? He was definitely on the Rockets, and then he played for the Grizzlies. He was a borderline all-star, blew out his knees, had a tragically shortened career. Chandler Parsons.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Got it.
Similar to Chandler Parsons in skill set. So there's just a lot of posts about, like, is Tim Duncan a top 10 overrated player? No. Was Derrick Rose going to beat LeBron before he blew out his knee? No. Should the Knicks trade for Chris Paul? No. Just all madness. So that's what's going on in the Discord. Madness. My obsession of the week, I think at this point, I'm going to go with a online webcomic.
Ooh.
Yeah, webcomic. I finished Buffy. It's a good show. But this week, I'm really enjoying Camp We Don't Wantcha. You heard of this comic, Em?
I have not.
So it's WeedonWantcha. It is currently on hiatus, to my knowledge. It was written by, and on hiatus since like 2018. So I'm pretty sure it's on hiatus for the foreseeable future. It's written by Katie Rice and Adam Wallander. And the comic follows three campers in the titular camp, We Don't Wantcha. And the premise is that these campers are dropped off one day at this camp and then left there by their parents forever. It's unclear, like, if their parents will ever come back. The camp is basically a dumping ground for kids that their parents just, for whatever reason, don't want them around anymore. And so they run around unsupervised, surviving off of the land, this kind of abandoned summer camp. They occasionally get supply drops that keep them from starving, but otherwise it's anarchy.
What the fuck?
It follows the main character of Malachi, who's a self-centered camper who tries to make everything all about himself constantly. 17, who is the 17th of 17 children, who is dropped off. She has a very sunny disposition. And Brian, who is very quiet, big and strong and quiet. So you get these three kind of archetypal characters, and you find out all the campers that are left there, kind of like how they ended up at camp, what led their parents to drop them off there, and then they have their interactions, as they're running around this camp, figuring out life. So it's a fun, zany little comic. It can get occasionally heavy, as you would imagine, and it also has just a lot of lighthearted fun. It's a pretty quick read, most of the comics, and I recommend it. I've read about 400 comics in the last day or two. So, good clip, enjoying it, almost to the end.
Yeah, I like the art style, is what I was going to say. It's just a cute little comic about child abandonment.
It is.
Fun. Yeah.
It is, and the abandonments some of them are rough.
It reminds me of Flapjack. You remember that show?
Yes. I think the art style, I believe it started in like 2011 or 2012, so that's about right, like in terms of the era and the art style inspiration. But it's a cool comic, I should say. There's some standout comics. There's one where a beaver gets memory boosted. That one's very good and also dark. When you learn how 17 got to camp, that's another one that sticks out to me. So yeah. Check it out. It's for free. It's low price of free, and it's comics, so it's quick. So without further ado, let's talk about leveling a little bit. Let's level up our discussion. Yeah, I said it twice. Sue me. So the reason that I was thinking about this was that a lot of games that I've been playing recently, and really for like the last 10 years at this point, this isn't a trend that's new in any way. Ever since Call of Duty 4, Call of Duty Modern Warfare, pretty much any game that could staple a leveling or progression system into it in some way has done so. And I wanted to start out with just like why? Like, why do we always go to this? Why does everything have to level up? Why do things have to unlock? Why aren't games built the way that they, for many years, were built? Like Halo, you don't unlock shit in that game. It starts out as Halo. Occasionally you will get other guns because the game gives you the gun, but not because you killed X number of grunts to get the gun. And so, Em, maybe you would have some more insight into this as someone who studied games on a more academic level.
I feel like the tendency to go towards leveling systems is because players want a sense of reward, and the gameplay that you are going to be presenting is not necessarily going to reward them constantly. So by tacking on a additional leveling system, you get the like serotonin effect of like, I have accomplished something, I have, unlocked such and such, I've raised my stats by whatever amount. Depending on the game you're playing, it could lead to like actual like mechanical rewards, but there's that sense of like accomplishment that you get where you have done something, you've achieved, and now the actual gameplay has not totally taken like a sideline to it, but it's sort of an extra thing, because Halo, there's no level progression. It's just you did the thing, you shot the enemies. You don't like, and I feel like Call of Duty also, you mentioned, I don't know if there's actual like stat rewards for leveling up, but there is some sort of like ranking system. You can tell I've never actually played a Call of Duty game.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Call of Duty 4, what the big innovation there was that during multiplayer when you were playing, you started with a fairly limited loadout in terms of what weapons you could pick to start, or what what tools you could bring in, what attachments you could add to your gun. It also had different kill streaks that you could get, so if you got a kill streak, you would unlock like super moves, basically, that would make your next kills easier. And the progression basically allowed you to unlock different guns to start the match with, different attachments to add to your gun, like better sights and stuff like that. And then also different kill streak bonuses, which, some people liked using a helicopter, which would let you take out people.
Right.
Some people would use a radar. Some people would use the AC-130, I think is the big gunship. So you would unlock these different ways of committing horrible murder.
So it's like internally in like each match you have a leveling system. It's not like your...
No, it's overall. So like internally in the match, the kill streaks would be kind of increase, and there is kind of internal to a match leveling. So if you get a longer kill streak, you will get more and more powerful super moves. But then as you level up by winning more and more matches and getting more and more kills, you will get access to different starting weapons that you can pick. So like maybe when you start at first, you have like 3 guns you can pick from, and they don't have iron sight, and they only have iron sights. And then as you keep leveling, you'll get a red dot sight, and then you'll get maybe a different machine gun. Like obviously these guns all work, but maybe you like this one better because it's a medium range and it shoots in a 3-shot burst instead of this gun that shoots full auto. So you get the ability to basically customize your character and make them play the way you want from the start of every match.
Gotcha. Okay. Huh. That's kind of neat.
Yeah, it's kind of neat, but it's also, in a way, an interesting decision as a developer to say, hey, there's all of these guns and playstyles that players could access, and instead of giving it to them and letting them choose and maybe letting the metagame play out as people gravitate towards different weapons and things like that, we're also going to put like 80% of the content behind a gate. So you have to play X number of hours before you can make decisions.
It's roadblocks because they don't want to overwhelm you, I guess, is also part of it. Like, Final Fantasy 14, for example, just because it's on my mind. A lot of the abilities that you get at later levels, if you had gotten your entire kit right off the bat, you would have no idea what the fuck is going on. You would just have like 80 different buttons and no idea what to push. But because you have a level progression, you kind of scale up, and things get more complex as you go. So I feel like that's sort of also part of it. Like, I'm sure if you looked at like Call of Duty, and what you get with each level, it's going to be more basic the lower you are, and then things are going to get way out of hand once you get up to like top tier stuff. Would you say that's, yeah?
Yes. It usually starts more basic. You get access to more and more specific guns. You'll start out with really general ones. And then I think this progression system, like if you've played Splatoon or Splatoon 2, that's also the case. You unlock access to more and more specific weapons. Like you might unlock the basic version of every gun, but then at a certain point, the unlocks are for slight modifications on damage or range, or just a different passive, a different grenade, and a different super move.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're just kind of finding which weapon best represents the way you like to play, and then you jump around between those.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I didn't really think of the stopping players from being overwhelmed perspective. Like having that nice natural gate. You can have the dopamine hit, but you can also ensure that your players are not getting overwhelmed immediately, which could definitely be the case in games like Call of Duty or Splatoon or really any multiplayer shooter where there's multiple guns available. It can be pretty jarring. Like Halo and games like that were developed to only have a handful of weapons. You don't have to worry about it so much. You know, there's some loadout, but the guns, you might have 10. Halo has like, what, 10 or 20 guns total?
It's been a while since I played a Halo. Probably. It's not a lot.
Probably closer to 20, but yeah.
Yeah, so you don't really need to do that much wrangling there, whereas the subtle differences between all of these different machine guns in a Call of Duty game, and then all the scopes and your attachments so that it doesn't have so much gun knockback and all these sorts of things. Like, you can get very granular very fast in those games. And at this point, I think that the level progression-based shooters have pretty much dinosaured all of the normal or kind of more traditional shooters. Like Destiny is a good example. That game, wildly popular. I don't understand it, but wildly popular. Has that level progression system, has down to like quests to a certain degree. They have levels for your levels in that game.
I wonder too, so Em, this point you make about not overwhelming the player, I wonder too how that connects with sort of, I don't know, maybe this is always something games did, but I think more modern games have this trend. I'm thinking of like things like Assassin's Creed, or I think it happens in Prince of Persia too, where you start the game with basically all your equipment and abilities. Or at least like
abilities.
Exactly, right? So like, okay, we're not going to overwhelm you, but we're going to give you a taste so you know, okay, here's what I'm hopefully building towards.
Yeah. Like, that's like classic, like Metroid did that too a lot. I think in every single Metroid you get reset back to 0, and then you have to work your way back up. So that's like, look at what you could be doing, and now we're gonna rip it all away so that you feel, I feel like there's a psychological, like, you have been slighted, like, we want to make you, like, angry, and then you will want to work towards regaining stuff that they kind of play with. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I wasn't really thinking about that, but
yeah, those progression systems, I think, because they're built into generally story moments or specific locations that you need to get to, they don't feel quite as straightforward, I should say, as some of the other progression systems. Like, for example, a game that kind of does both is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It's one we've played for the show before. That game has a leveling system and this kind of item-based progression system at the same time. And I've found that the item-based progression feels to me a little bit more organic, because you're finding these items in the world, and once you have access to them, it unlocks your skills. The leveling in that game is handled by just X amount of enemies you kill give you experience, and that experience unlocks a level, and then your levels will allow you to cast slightly more spells, use slightly more items, and deal slightly more damage. And just toggling a number a little bit higher does not feel as impactful as getting a double jump, for example. And so thankfully that game doesn't lock features like a double jump or anything like that behind your actual level. But I can see in some other games like that, those basic skills, when they are locked behind an arbitrary number of enemies killed, it's really frustrating for me.
Mm-hmm.
So we can see that that leveling systems allow us to gate progression so that players are not overwhelmed. It also allows you to have that little slight dopamine hit. Now, it's very conventional, like we said, where you kill a few enemies, you get experience, and then that eventually ticks over a number, at which point you level up. The most straightforward way that you do this is, like I said in Symphony of the Night, like you just get some stat boosts, that's it, period. Sometimes you can get like a slightly more advanced form of leveling, like in Pokemon, for example. You hit an arbitrary number of experience, now you level up, you get slightly more stats, and maybe an ability.
Mm-hmm.
And that ability is maybe something that you choose whether you want it or not, or maybe it's a decision tree, like an XCOM, like you're picking between one of two things. And then some games try to get a little bit more crafty in their progression. They try to come up with some unique ways of having your player make an intelligent choice about how they're leveling. Are there any games that jump out to you in terms of how they handle the leveling? Because there's a lot of games that take the straightforward approach, but I think that the more interesting examples are the games that try to get weird with it.
I'm sure we're going to discuss tons of games from this series, but thanks to our recent foray into strategy games, I've been playing a lot more Final Fantasy Tactics lately.
Hell yeah!
Mm-hmm.
Right? And they do an interesting things where there's basically two tracks to your leveling. Your straight experience points, they handle your stat boosts, attack, defense, that sort of thing. The other thing you get is you have certain jobs, and these jobs are associated with certain skills you get by using weapons. So, it's a little convoluted, but it makes sense when you play it. But the thing that I find most interesting about it is it solves one of the biggest problems with level progression in squad-based games. So, there's the question is, okay, do squad members who aren't in the active party level up? And Final Fantasy's answer is basically, okay, yes and no. They don't gain levels because they don't get experience points, but they do get new skills because they gain action points. Mm-hmm. So I think this is an interesting way to be like, okay, it makes sense to pay attention to your other party members, even if they're not in your top 6, right? Because they will still get these action points. And I appreciate that. When a game just sort of says, okay, if you don't use these characters, they get nothing, I instantly disregard all my other characters.
Yeah, you're just greatly incentivized to have those 6 be awesome and take care of all of the relevant situations. But once you have a backbench that is actually gaining experience when they're on the bench, you can start getting creative about instead of having generalized tools, instead of everyone being a Swiss Army knife, you can let people be a hammer or a screwdriver. I think that for that example, like the leveling off of the equipment that you get in Final Fantasy, is that Tactics or Tactics Advance? I think that's Advance, right?
So I'm playing Tactics A2, so it's the second advanced game. Yeah.
Oh, hell yeah. We got a Lua in there?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I really like that example because some of the other FF games, and not just those, but I'm thinking right now specifically 10.2 and 9, they attach your leveling to items that you equip. Like, the characters do not have abilities intrinsic to themselves. They equip certain items, and then that gets you experience points that will unlock a skill permanently. Like, the item will give you the skill, and then you're putting ability points into whatever item skills you have. And that kind of allows the item to take on some sort of identity of its own. Like, you want to have an item outside of just the stats that it happens to bear.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of solves one of the other problems, I think, with RPGs specifically, but it happens across multiple types of games where you have an incentive to equip items because they are the most recent thing you can buy at a shop and they're appropriate to your level and the types of enemies you're fighting. But once you've out-leveled that item, it's trash from then on with no reason to ever revisit it. Tying some of your attacks or your abilities to the item itself gives that item a second utility that otherwise it wouldn't have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the Final Fantasy VII Remake has a system for that in there. I like this game, but a lot of people don't. Bravely Default kind of takes that and attaches it to your classes, where you can have you have your core set of abilities for the class, and then there's usually like a passive ability that you can borrow if you put enough investment into the class. So you kind of can linger in classes for longer so that you get these better abilities. And maybe you don't fall in love with the class and you take it to whatever your main is going to be. Or maybe you need some more like utility, so you dip into a certain class, get the ability that you need, and then change back to what you were doing. So there's a little bit more thought to it when you're like mixing and matching stuff, as opposed to just, I'm going to become a monk and I'm going to hit things forever, and not worry about, what my side abilities are. So I kind of like that, actually. Has like a little bit more dynamic leveling system, because once you reach like max in a class, what's the point of ever switching to something else? Or you just bounce around forever,
Yeah, and if you can make the combat efficacy, it's good if you can make the decision about what class you're going to be in relevant outside of just invalidating a choice that someone's made. Like, it's one thing if you invest all your time in the monk class and then they say, hey, maybe you need to try a different class because now your monk does nothing. It's more interesting to me if you're making a choice because dabbling in other classes can feed back into the class that you're maining in some interesting way, instead of just invalidating the current progression you've been taking. No one likes boxing themselves in without knowing it,
Like when you reach higher level things and then everything is weak to magic and resists your bludgeoning damage, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then your monk is useless. Yeah.
Yeah, or like, hey, guess what? We're in this area where it's all undead, so sorry if you didn't have a white mage or something in your party to deal with this. Or, hey, all these enemies are vulnerable to status magic, but they have very high defense. Oh, you didn't have anyone who does status magic? Tough. You should have diversified. Always more interesting when you can make these items or jobs relevant across multiple moments in the game without having to resort to invalidating playstyles. So in terms of progression, I think tying abilities and skills to items is one unique way to kind of get around the main level up, get greater skill. Kind of the standard CRPG way of doing things, where you're just getting experience and then maybe there's a tree, a skill tree. And skill, not to say that there's anything wrong with skill trees. I think skill trees are a great improvement over the more simplistic forms like the Pokemon that we discussed earlier. But I find that skill trees are pretty straightforward. Like, they're very understandable. You can see a skill tree in, like, for example, any BioWare game. Almost all of them utilize skill trees of some kind. You just have a bunch of different stats you can put points into, and then as you get more and more points in a stat, you'll eventually... Actually, no, that's not a skill tree. They just dump points into it. Skill tree is... What's a better example for a skill tree?
Let's see. The one I always think of... what's that game called? Fighting robots in the snow.
Metabots.
Girl with a spear.
Mech Warrior.
No.
Mech Warrior doesn't.
Horizon Zero Dawn.
Okay.
That was like the quintessential skill tree that I played for probably about 200 hours when it first came out. It is fairly straightforward. You have like 3 different avenues in which to put your skills. You start with like the most basic thing that costs a certain number of points, and then it kind of branches into like 2 different things. Maybe it's like, do you want to do a cool new attack, or do you want to upgrade one of your other sorts of offensive abilities? There was another route for like hacking stuff because you were fighting robots, and so that was always cool. I forget the rest. I haven't played that game in probably like, I don't know, 5 years now.
Yeah, but that's kind of the main thing for skill trees. Like if you know data structures, or if you can just imagine a tree, it starts with a single spoke and then it branches out into branches, and then those branches branch into branches. And that kind of allows you to make progression in multiple avenues. Like you start in a simple place, but eventually you can kind of customize your character by going down these different branches. What I was thinking with the BioWare one is it's more of a just skill point system where there's X number of buckets to put your experience points into, and depending on which bucket you put your points into, you get different buffs, debuffs, and skills.
Mm-hmm.
Which is how BioWare handled it with the Mass Effect series. I think that's also the way Dragon Age handled it. That was definitely how Jade Empire handled leveling. And that's an interesting way of handling things. Like you basically get these skill points that you gain every single X number of experience, and then you're kind of unlocking skills. And you can choose if you want to specialize in one and just dump all your points into one thing, or spread it out across multiple different categories. But I find that style of leveling to be fairly simple to understand and have fairly obvious trade-offs. I like the weird shit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, leveling systems that all of a sudden play real weird. Like I'm a big what's everyone's stance on the sphere grid?
I have no familiarity with it, but from all the things I do know, it seems way too complicated. Like there's so many, like it's basically a board game, like the most complicated board game in the world.
It's not it's not the most complicated board game in the world, but it is a board game. Yeah. This is definitely true. It's a grid, literally. So the way that, and this is from Final Fantasy X, it's kind of an famous or infamous, depending on your opinion on it, leveling system. But the idea behind it is that each of your characters start out in some point on this grid with nodes, and as you level up, you kind of move along this grid. And it moves fairly linearly at first. You can only really go forward. You can spend 1 level to go forward or to go back up to 4 slots to places you've already been. And then you can kind of slot in these spheres into empty nodes that you pass over to upgrade your character's stats. So your stats are not dependent on just leveling. Depending on who your character is, where they are on the grid, and where you move them to, they get access to increasing their speed or increasing their power. And so your characters are less defined as the game goes on by what their level is and what their character quote-unquote class is, but by where they are in the grid. If you just move them forward constantly and never spoke off in any direction, they will basically turn into a character class, an archetypal character class. But because it's this kind of branching grid, you can get a little bit crazy. Like you can go to spots where one person's section of the grid overlaps or comes close to another person's section, and there'll be gates that kind of gate off access to another section of the grid. And if you just remove those gates by using certain key spheres is what they're called, they just remove these blockers, you can jump from one section of the grid to another. So like, for example, Titus, the main character of the game, is based on speed for the most part. He gets some speed-based magic. He can do some stuff with like delaying opponents' attacks. He can boost power a little bit. But he's kind of a middle-of-the-road attacker. He's, I think, the fastest party member or close to it. And that's kind of how he'll play the whole game if you just keep him on the track. And then at the end, he would kind of come up to a dead end where he would jump onto Yuna's section of the sphere grid. She's your white mage. So he'll kind of start getting access to some of her abilities. Or maybe it's Yuna that ends up on Titus's section. Either way, like, you dead end and then you kind of end up at where someone else's sphere grid begins. But his sphere grid also is adjacent to Auron, who is kind of your heavy hitter knight class, basically. He's a samurai / knight. And so you can kind of jump Titus from his section into Auron's section, and all of a sudden you get this heavy hitter who's also very fast. But you can also do weird stuff like they have teleport spheres, which let you teleport your character from wherever they are to where someone else is. So you can just jump them to someone else's section of the sphere grid. You get some items that let you just gain abilities without having to navigate up to them. If someone else in your party has gotten this ability, you can just get it. You don't have to move to wherever they are. And so you get these kind of interesting choices that you're making. Now, like you said, it's obviously really difficult to grok all of this early on, to understand any of this shit. The first time you play it, you'll probably just play FF10 and follow the straight line. And that's kind of one of the brilliant parts of the sphere grid, is that you can just go in a straight line and it'll play out with your characters developing into archetypal characters with maybe slight tweaks if you've done some stuff. But when you have knowledge of the underlying system, now you can start hybridizing your characters and making intelligent tweaks about how they're going to play. And it's not intuitive, but it allows for a lot of customizability. And it becomes kind of this game within a game. The act of just leveling up your character.
You remember Mario Party?
Hell yeah.
It sounds like you're just doing a Mario Party inside of your Final Fantasy.
Kind of are.
Interesting.
You kind of are. That's not inaccurate. You're sliding around on this game board that is unlocking skills and stats.
Final Fantasy has a bunch of weird leveling systems. What do you think of 12's? I don't know what they call it. It's also a grid.
Job grid.
Job grid, yeah.
The job.
What do you think of that?
I think it's the job grid. The license board. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like the license board. Well, I like it in the remastered version of the game. I don't like it in the original game. And that's just because, and we've covered this in the FF12 podcast, if anyone wants to listen to that one. I think it's Final Fantasy by the Dozen is the name of that podcast series. But in the original game, my issue with it is that there's certain sections on the grid that have access to summons or quickenings, which are kind of your super move in that game. And they're spread out kind of equally across the grid, and that just kind of forces you to send certain characters or send some characters down very specific paths so that you can get access to this super move, even if you don't want any of the shit that you're unlocking on the way there, because the super move is more important than whatever you unlocked.
Gotcha.
So, like, I had to make someone master, I think, like, maces or scales or something. And they're weapons that I would never use and don't want to ever use, but I need to master this so that I can get access to their super attack. It's actually a little bit similar to the sphere grid in a way, that system. Don't mind it. I think it's okay. I think that the idea of unlocking the right to use an item that you already own is just a level of bureaucracy that I find really annoying. It's the only game I've ever played that forced me to unlock a license after I had already bought the item. As if I'm going to get arrested for using this sword. Excuse me, sir. Let me see your license for this sword. Oh, sorry.
Are you checked out for that?
You're licensed for Small Swords 2. This is Small Swords 3 license, so I have to take you in.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Captain Bosch von Ronsenberg of Dalmasca. Come with me.
Is that a real thing? That's
Yes.
a person.
That's a person's name. Yep.
Why is Final Fantasy like this?
I don't know.
I
Why
ask
is why are
myself
games
that
like
every
this?
day. It's a mystery.
As we're talking about weird decisions, we've always got the junction system, and we've always got
Oh, fuck.
yeah. Oh, fuck. And the junction system, actually, I'm not going to go into that, like how that thing works, because it's not actually leveling based, most of the power in that system. But something that comes up with 8 and another game that we've played in the past, Fallout 3, and kind of the Fallout games in general, basically anything that was made in the new Fallouts or the Elder Scrolls games, is the concept of enemies scaling with your level. So progression systems are supposed to give you this slight dopamine hit. Maybe it's going to gate access to certain abilities until later on. But there's always this implication that you'll get better than the stuff you're fighting, right? Like if you fight a scorpion in the first 5 minutes of the game, it will be much easier if you fight them, 2 hours down. And then by the end of the game, maybe they're trivial. But there are some games that decide to scale the enemies with your level. And so enemies just stay roughly as difficult as they are the whole time. You just get access to some certain extra skills, extra abilities, extra attacks, and maybe you become a little bit more effective or a little bit more comfortable approaching these scenarios. But you never become dominant in terms of just damage output, unless you get maybe a specific item or something that makes you more powerful. How do you feel about games that take that approach?
I mean, there's some, like, I'm already thinking of the counterpoint to this, which is Dark Souls 1. I believe that was the one where you fight this boss really early on. It's like the big demon on the wall, and then towards the end of the game you see like you're in basically hell, and then you are fighting these as like regular enemies.
Yep.
And you are crushing them, and it feels really good. And I think having that sort of like accomplishment of these things that I once had to grind for like a couple of hours just to beat the one, I'm now taking on like 2 or 3 at a time, and kind of handily taking care of them. I feel like that stuck with me a lot more than when I would run into like the same group of, spiders in a, Dragon Age. Because Dragon Age, I think, scales everything to your level consistently.
The same thing happens in BioShock.
Oh, yeah.
Where, like, initially the big daddies are, they're the big bad. They're a pain in the ass to deal with, and you have to, like, strategize and, like, lead them to the right spot.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually you just end up just wrecking them.
Yeah.
Basically, once you get the crossbow.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, in that case, it was a little sad for me. Like, this used to be, like, they were the champions of their domain, and now you're just mowing them down. So, I mean, there's something to be said for scaling something like that, like a mini boss, or like if they need to maintain a certain level of intimidation, I guess I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, agreed. And I think that the game really needs to make a hard choice when you do something like this, when you make a scaling decision. What needs to scale, what doesn't, and how do you decide which falls into which bucket? Like, I think that the Elder Scrolls games and the Fallout games by extension, it kind of hurts those games that the enemies feel largely the same throughout. I find that most of the enemies that are easy in the early game are easy in the mid game and also easy in the late game. And then there's some enemies that are just miserable in the early game, miserable in the late game, and so on and so forth. And it leads to the game feeling greatly homogenized. There are some enemies that stand out because they're truly unique, but a lot of the game feels really samey because the mechanics are scaling with you. Like, maybe you're doing more damage or you're getting extra skills, but you're never crushing things. Like, you might find a way to crush things in the first 5 minutes and then it'll apply for hour 50. But the world doesn't feel radically different. In those games, it's really like what you're doing to the world in terms of blowing stuff up or who you're meeting that makes them stick with you. But the act of playing them and progressing in them feels like running on a treadmill, but never getting anywhere. As opposed to the treadmills that get you places.
Of course.
I think that FF8 is another example. Like, that game, when the enemies scale with you, it can be kind of interesting but only because of some other weird shit about that game. Because your relative level of power does not correspond with your level in any meaningful way, the fact that your enemies are starting to level up the higher your level gets actually makes some of those early enemies become scary if you haven't been mastering the game's systems properly. If you try to power level, you will actually end up screwing yourself because the enemies you're fighting against will keep progressing and you won't, because the way you get power in that game is through items and magic. So it kind of gives a second life to a lot of very normal enemies that they otherwise wouldn't have. Like, there are some base enemies that are complete jokes in the early game, and then when you fight them, if they're level like 40 or 50, they gain a bunch of really scary new abilities that can wipe your party if you're not careful.
Can I ask if you think that is intentional, or do you think that is like they didn't factor something correctly, and so power leveling just makes the game strange?
I think that they intentionally based the game's leveling system around items and magic, and that was an intentional choice. I don't know that they understood that some players would not get that because it's so counterintuitive to the way these other games play. And so you don't realize that you can power level yourself into to put your back against the wall. Like, you can really screw yourself in that game if you power level. And so I think it's an interesting choice. Like, you need to figure this game out properly or else you'll just get brick walled. But I wouldn't call that a good system necessarily. It's interesting because no one else has done it.
Because it's a mistake.
Probably. I mean, I think that, but then the inverse is also true. Like, you can become incredibly powerful in that game without leveling once. Like, you can fight maybe 100 enemies the entire game and beat it. And that's completely valid. A completely valid way to play that game. And most RPGs can't have that high, but they also don't have the low where, like, oh crap, this Wendigo that I was fighting in hour 5 all of a sudden gained the ability to dunk my party and dribble them to death, which is a move that they get. It's terrifying. They grab one of your party members and they squish them into a little ball.
Oh, I've seen this. Yeah.
They dribble them a few times, and then they, like, whack them into your party, just bounce them at you. They power dunk you. It's fucked up.
It's weird.
Yeah. So are there any leveling systems that y'all have seen that, like, really stick out as innovative or big mistakes? Like, are there any that haven't really worked for you?
Just while we're on the subject of BioShock, I mean, this isn't necessarily the leveling system's fault, but, like, there needs to be some sort of, like, consequences to progression. I think we've talked about this in our BioShock episode, but, like, whether or not you save or harvest, let's say, the little sisters, you can still unlock basically all the abilities. So, like, this is a case where they're trying to use level progression as, like, story driver, and yet they wussed out. You know what I mean? Like, they didn't really follow through with it. So I think there is something to be said for using levels as story, but you need to commit and make solid consequences, even if maybe some people will be a little disappointed they can't unlock everything.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's such a weird balancing act to strike because if you're going to be putting mechanics into your game, you want the player to experience them. So if you are going to make it so they can, like, have 80 different options to level, but the story is only going to take them as far as, like, 50, they're going to have to make hard choices. And I feel like players would rather not make decisions and pick everything than have to, like, lock themselves out of certain options. Because ultimately you want to experience everything, or at least a majority of what you can get out of a game. So having, like, stuff that you cannot reach kind of feels bad.
Yeah, and I definitely get that. It's just when your game is set up in such a way as BioShock, where it's trying to make a hard argument about the value of human life and whether these decisions that led this civilization to ruin are really dangerous and we should reject them, or should we embrace the way that these people lived. it does feel like a bit of a cop-out when you get all the same powers or more, regardless of whichever path you go down.
Yeah, that's fair.
In some way, I feel like the most radical way to play that game would be to kill no Big Daddies. Which I don't know if that's even an option. I guess you could. You don't have to kill them, right?
No, I mean, I don't think you need to to advance the levels.
You have to kill like one.
Maybe probably the first one where it's like the tutorial Big Daddy.
That would be an interesting way to play that game. I don't know if
try
that's
it.
even possible, but we should try it.
Let's see if we can do a pacifist run of Bioshock.
Hey guys. Hey Splicers. We can talk this out. You guys seem cool. Your masks are very, very fancy.
So there's a game I really used to love for the Game Boy Color.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's around anymore, but the game was called Revelations: The Demon Slayer.
What?
Yeah, it was a weird game, but it was a really good one. But there was like this monster capturing mechanic where like in order to capture them, you had to negotiate with them. So you had to like convince these monsters to join their party.
This sounds like a Shin Megami Tensei game, I'm not going to lie. Let me look this up.
Yeah, Revelations: The Demon Slayer. But the way you like improved like your party of monsters that you had convinced was by combining two of your monsters to create one stronger one.
That totally is a precursor to the Shin Megami Tensei series.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Same.
regardless. Right, so I like your party didn't really like level up that much as far as I remember. So like you needed to like get all these various monsters and just smash them together until you found the strongest combination, which I always sort of liked because there's something like there's something interesting about like, oh, here I have a floating skull and this is like a sentient mud pile and I combine them, I get a bird monster. Excellent. Like a way that like experience doesn't matter, but just chatting these monsters into your party does.
Yes, Revelations: The Demon Slayer, known as Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible in Japan, stars the young hero L and eventually his two companions. So yes, this is a portable spin-off of the Megami Tensei series for the Game Boy Color.
Yep.
So yeah, Pete, you were playing a precursor to eventually the series that would give birth to the Persona series.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, cool. Well, look, if I can recommend a game for the Game Boy Color, it would be Revelations: The Demon Slayer.
If I could recommend a game for the Game Boy Color, I would recommend Dragon Warrior Monsters for the Game Boy Color. It is a precursor to the Dragon Warrior. I think it eventually just became. It was eventually the Dragon Warrior Monsters series that came out, I think, in. What was it called? Like, it was named weirdly. I remember seeing it named really weirdly. But you're basically playing Dragon Warrior and you're capturing the monsters that you run up against in this Pokemon. But you can fuse them together. That was the thing. Eventually, you had to fuse them to get the good ones. Yeah. So one last progression level system that I always really enjoyed was the one from Legend of Legaia, because it's a little bit unintuitive in its application. So the way that game worked was you were basically playing a first-person, almost like a fighting game where you were scripting out the moves, and you had a bar that could take up to X number of moves, and depending on basically like you're inputting up, down, left, right, as if it's a fighting game or something, but your action bar was only so long, and depending on whether you were using specific weapons or your dominant hand or your weak hand, like sometimes your attack like input would be longer or shorter, so it could take up a larger or smaller chunk of your attack bar. And as you leveled up, your attack bar got longer, so you could chain together longer and longer hit strings, and that allowed you to unlock skills that would be like, your attack inputs in a Street Fighter game. If you go like up, down, up, maybe it does some sort of fancy punch or something. And in this game, you could get longer and longer chains, which would then allow you to do multiple combos per attack. So it was basically this bar that would get longer, and that seems fairly normal or fairly straightforward, but actually it's gating a bunch of super moves that you can use as well. Yeah, so that was one that I always really enjoyed because it looked fairly straightforward at first, but as you learned more about the game, you realized that, oh, this is unlocking the ability to do fancy combos that I couldn't do before. It seemed pretty elegant. So I think leveling has gotten into a weird spot where every game needs to have it, but not every game does it well. There's some games that seem to just staple it on, but when done properly, I think that progression systems can still be very interesting. They're always at least engaging, I think, on a base level. It's nice to see bars go up, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of sort of the ideas of like what makes games addictive. It's leveling combined with, what's the term? Like variable rewards. So you don't always get rewarded for a thing. I mean, that's how Skinner trained his rats, and it more or less works on us too, distressingly.
True. And sometimes, if you make the system a board game, people will do it to themselves. So with that, I think that's everything I had to discuss with leveling. Talked about some of the games that I really enjoyed, some of the pitfalls, and some of the reasons why you might employ such a system. So listeners, if you have any leveling systems you'd like to shout out or any topics that you think we missed, feel free to write in at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. You can also support the show on patreon.com/deeplistens. Thank you, Pete.
Yep, an interesting topic that maybe doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, perhaps, potentially.
Thank you, Em.
Thank you. I've now found all of the articles about leveling that I will probably put in the Discord for those who are in there. There's a chart that is just like skill on the left axis, difficulty along the bottom, boredom in the upper corner, anxiety at the bottom, and then flow. And I love this chart. I'm going to post it.
Sounds like a cool chart. Do you want people to just be in the middle? Do you want them to just flow all the time?
I think you want them to kind of dip into boredom and anxiety at times, but mostly you want them to flow. And any game that can get that down is probably going to be addicting, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So if you can keep them in this part of the chart, they're addicted. If you put them in this part of the chart, they quit.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Where do the whales fit? If I put them to the top right, do they go to Nirvana?
I think the whales are probably very anxious.
Just constantly anxious, scared about status.
Anyway, there's a lot of good articles about this too. I'll probably post some links.
Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. Till next time. Peace.
Break it down like this.